The breaking point. The hall of the Galactic Council shimmered with banners of 100 species, and the ceiling glowed with the light of distant stars. Every delegate in the chamber believed this summit would end in another long debate, where the humans would eventually bend as they always did, offering patience, compromise, and calm words in the face of arrogance. But this time was different. The human delegation walked in with an air that seemed heavy, as though they had carried the weight of too many insults and too many sacrifices for too long. Their ambassador, Elias Ward, was known for his calm voice and diplomatic skill. Yet as he took his seat, there was no warmth in his expression. The council chancellor, a tall avian being with golden feathers, opened the summit with grand words about unity and peace, but even as he spoke, laughter and dismissive murmurs came from other delegates whenever the word human was mentioned. They had grown too used to mocking the species that had defended borders and provided resources without demanding glory. The debates dragged on for hours. Humanity's proposals were reasonable. Shared patrols in pirate-infested regions, fairer trade routes, equal voting rights within the council decisions. Yet every suggestion was twisted or ridiculed. A reptilian warlord hissed that humans were weak farmers pretending to be soldiers. A crystalline envoy laughed that humans were a short-lived species desperate for recognition. Each insult was a needle pressed deeper into the patience of the human delegation. Elias sat quietly, his hands folded, listening as one by one the voices around the chamber dismissed his words. He had seen it before, but this time he did not feel the duty to endure it. When he finally rose, the entire chamber fell silent. There was no loud bang of a gavel, no outburst of fury, only his measured tone echoing through the vast chamber. He spoke of battles where human fleets had defended worlds not their own, of trade routes where human merchants carried supplies to colonies on the edge of survival, of peace treaties where humanity had been the one to hold the line between rivals who would have destroyed each other. He reminded them that every time, humanity had been told to wait for recognition, to wait for fairness, to wait for respect that never came. His voice carried the exhaustion of generations, and even those who hated humans felt the weight of his words. Then came the moment no one expected. Elias looked at the council floor, at the circle of species who thought themselves above his people, and declared that humanity would no longer take part in these games. "We came here in good faith," he said, his voice steady. "We offered peace, fairness, and cooperation. You mocked us. You insulted us. You made clear that to you, humanity is nothing but a tool to be used. So hear me now, we withdraw. Humanity will no longer beg for a seat at this table. We will decide our path without you." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The avian chancellor tried to interrupt, but Elias raised a hand and silence fell again. The other human delegates rose with him, their faces calm but unyielding. Without another word they walked out, their footsteps echoing like drums of finality. The great doors of the chamber closed behind them, and for the first time in centuries the Galactic Council felt the weight of absence. The seat of humanity, once a symbol of patience and balance, was left empty. At first there was stunned silence. Then the chamber erupted into noise. Some laughed nervously, insisting humanity would return as they always did. Others whispered in worry, remembering how human fleets had been the shield of frontier colonies. A few species often scorned themselves, looked at the empty chair and wondered if this was the beginning of something much larger than they understood. For the first time in living memory, the council realized they might have pushed too far. Humanity had left not with anger, but with the quiet finality of a people who had made their decision. As the chamber dissolved into chaos, Elias Ward and his delegation walked through the shining halls toward their ship. They did not look back. The stars outside awaited them, silent and vast, and for the first time in centuries humanity was walking away from the council that had never truly welcomed them. And in that silence, in that empty chair left behind, the seeds of regret were already beginning to grow. The empty chair. The council chamber did not recover from the shock of that moment. The seat of humanity remained empty, and though it was just a chair like any other, it grew into a symbol that unsettled the heart of every delegate. Meetings resumed the following days, but they lacked their usual rhythm. Whenever disputes broke out, the humans were not there to mediate or calm the tension. For years, humanity had been the quiet balance in the storm, offering compromise, building bridges, carrying more than their share to hold the galaxy together. Without them, the chamber seemed louder, Harsher, more divided. At first, many believed it was a bluff. Species that had long mocked humans told their followers that humanity would return once they realized how much they needed the council. They laughed openly, saying humans had always been desperate for acceptance. But days turned into weeks and the humans did not return. No envoys came to reopen talks. No messages of apology were sent. Their silence was total, and that silence carried weight heavier than any words beyond the council's walls. The galaxy began to feel the absence more keenly. Trade caravans that once had safe passage under human escort now traveled in fear. Pirate raiders, long held at bay by human patrol fleets, struck with boldness, taking cargo, enslaving crews, and vanishing into the void. Small colonies that had depended on human convoys for supplies began to send desperate messages for help, messages that now went unanswered. The Council tried to redirect its fleets, but every species had its own interests first. No one wanted to sacrifice their warships to protect worlds that were not theirs. Not when humanity had always taken on that role before. Within the chamber, rivalries once kept in check began to flare. The reptilian warlords' delegation clashed with the crystalline envoys over border disputes, each accusing the other of weakness. The avian chancellor called for unity, but his words rang hollow without humanity present to reinforce them. Delegates whispered of conspiracies, accusing humans of plotting in secret. Some believed the humans were preparing for war, building weapons in silence. Others thought they had withdrawn only to pressure the council into offering them more power. The uncertainty gnawed at every ambassador's mind in private quarters. A few delegates spoke in hushed tones of what humanity truly meant to the galaxy. The insectoid envoy from the frontier admitted to her aides that her people would have been destroyed decades ago, if not for human fleets. The amphibian merchants muttered that without humans patrolling the trade lanes, their profits were collapsing. Slowly, regret began to seep through the cracks of arrogance, though none dared admit it aloud in the open chamber. Meanwhile, reports came from the edges of human space. Scouts whispered of massive shipbuilding efforts, yards working day and night to construct new fleets. Training drills filled the skies above Earth and Mars, while colonies across human worlds poured resources into fortifications. Yet no hostile moves were made. The humans were not attacking, not threatening, only withdrawing and preparing. It was the quiet preparation that frightened the council more than open hostility would have. A silent human was more dangerous than an angry one. In the council, the empty chair remained. At every meeting, delegates found their eyes drawn to it. They remembered how Elias Ward had walked out, his words calm but final. Some began to think back on the insults they had thrown so carelessly, the laughter they had shared at human expense, and for the first time they wondered what would happen if humans truly never returned. Could the council hold together without them? Could the galaxy itself survive without the strange, stubborn species that had always been there to fill the gaps others refused to take? The Chancellor called for renewed efforts to bring the humans back. Envoys were dispatched with messages of reconciliation, carefully worded letters of apology hidden beneath layers of formality. But every attempt was met with silence. Human officials received the messages, acknowledged them, and gave no reply. The doors remained closed, the chair remained empty, and the silence continued to grow heavier with each passing day. In the great cities of the Council worlds, ordinary citizens began to speak of it as well. Merchants cursed the lack of human escorts. Colonists prayed for the return of human convoys. Soldiers who had fought alongside humans remembered their bravery and discipline, and now feared what a galaxy without them would look like. The people began to see what their leaders had refused to admit for too long. Humanity had been the backbone of the peace they all enjoyed, and now that backbone was gone, and so the chamber sat each day, the banners of 100 species fluttering above, the voices of 100 delegates clashing below, and always that one seat empty, a silent reminder of a mistake too great to ignore. The council had thought humanity would beg to return. Instead, they were left to wrestle with a terrifying truth. The humans had walked away and the galaxy was beginning to crumble without them. Regrets and realizations. The silence of humanity became a wound the council could not heal. The weeks stretched into months and the galaxy changed in ways no one had predicted. At first, the council had laughed, saying that humanity's absence would be nothing more than an inconvenience. But as the days passed, the absence became a hollow space that grew larger with every crisis. The humans had been the ones who carried the burden of keeping the fragile network of trade and defense alive, and now that burden lay uncarried, the weight pressing down on everyone on the frontier worlds. Colonies once secure under human patrols found themselves defenseless. Pirates descended in greater numbers than ever before, raiding stations, capturing transports, and leaving destruction behind. When desperate calls for help reached the council, the delegates argued endlessly over whose fleets should respond. Each species demanded that another take the risk, and so the appeals went unanswered. For decades, humanity had quietly taken those burdens, rarely asking for thanks. Now their silence was a mirror showing the council what they truly were. Without humans holding the line, merchants across the core worlds began to complain loudly as their profits collapsed. Trade routes that had run smooth for decades became dangerous journeys. Insurance costs soared, convoys slowed, and goods rotted in storage bays waiting for safe passage. It became clear that humans had not only guarded the routes, but had made them work through sheer persistence and willingness to sacrifice. Alien corporations that had mocked human stubbornness now whispered that they would pay anything to see human escorts return. The bitter taste of regret spread across the stars. The military consequences grew worse each month. Minor border skirmishes between rival species erupted into larger conflicts. Without human fleets acting as neutral peacekeepers, old grudges rose like monsters from the deep. The reptilian warlord whose insults had helped drive humanity out launched a campaign against his crystalline neighbors, claiming new territory, while the council was paralyzed. In the past, human ships would have appeared to enforce ceasefires, but now there was nothing. The council tried to organize joint patrols, but distrust ran too deep. No one wanted to fight side by side when they all remembered how easily humans had filled that role without complaint. In quiet moments, some delegates admitted the truth to themselves. They had built the illusion of peace on the foundation of human strength and human patience. That foundation had been invisible because humanity had asked for so little in return. But now that it was gone, the whole structure was collapsing. The insectoid envoy, whose colonies had survived thanks to human convoys, found herself unable to sleep, haunted by the image of Elias Ward's calm face as he walked out. The amphibian merchant guilds began sending secret feelers to human space, begging for trade agreements outside the council's reach. Each gesture was ignored, but the desperation grew. The council chambers themselves became a place of constant chaos. The empty chair had become more than a symbol. It was a ghost at the table, a silent reminder of failure. Every time voices rose in argument, eyes drifted to that chair. Every time a delegate called for order, the silence of humanity reminded them of how little control they had left. The chancellor tried to project strength, but his golden feathers had lost their luster, and his speeches sounded hollow against the growing storms outside the chamber walls. Beyond politics and trade, ordinary citizens began to speak differently about humans. Once mocked as impulsive and rough, they were now remembered as brave and dependable. Stories spread of human soldiers who had held the line when others fled, of human captains who had escorted alien convoys without asking for reward, of human doctors who had stayed behind on plague worlds to treat the dying. What had been overlooked in the noise of arrogance now shone bright in memory. Regret seeped into every corner of the galaxy, and whispers turned into open discussions about how much they had lost. Meanwhile, human space remained quiet and closed. No raids, no invasions, no grand announcements. Instead, there were reports of massive construction, of fleets being built in silence, of colonies training as though for war. The council was forced to watch helplessly, uncertain whether humanity was preparing to defend itself or preparing to strike. That uncertainty gnawed at them more than any open hostility would have. They had thought humans needed the council. Now they feared it was the other way around, and still the empty chair waited. Every session began with its presence looming over the chamber. Every decision felt smaller without the steady hand that once guided them. The council had thought themselves wise and eternal, but now they realized they had built their peace on the backs of a people they had never respected. The mistake was clear, and the galaxy was beginning to pay the price. Humanity had withdrawn, and the council could no longer deny the truth. They had driven away the very species that had held the galaxy together, the human silence. The galaxy had grown used to the sound of human voices in every hall of power and every battlefield where peace was fragile. Now that silence was louder than war drums, the council sent envoys again and again, each carrying gifts, apologies, and promises of change. But the humans answered with nothing. Their ships did not come to Council space. Their diplomats did not step foot in the chamber, and even their trade routes bent inward, no longer reaching toward other species. To the galaxy, humanity had vanished into its own shadow. The alien spies sent to the borders of human space reported activity that unsettled the Council. Shipyards on Earth and Mars glowed like furnaces, birthing warships at a pace never seen before. Colonies across human systems drilled their militias, soldiers trained day and night, and resources once traded freely now disappeared into hidden stockpiles. Yet through all this buildup, humanity did not cross their borders, did not threaten, did not attack. They only prepared, and that quiet determination terrified those who watched. It was like standing at the edge of a storm, feeling the pressure grow heavier with each passing hour, waiting for the moment when the winds would break. Inside the council chamber, the debates grew more frantic. Some delegates demanded that the council act before humanity became too powerful. Others argued that to act against them now would ignite a war no one could win. The chancellor tried to maintain order, but every session spiraled into shouts and accusations. Always the empty chair seemed to stare back at them. It was as though humanity was still present, judging them without speaking a word. That silence weighed on their hearts more than any insult ever had. Ordinary people across the galaxy began to speak more openly about what they had lost. Merchants cursed the long delays in trade that had once been smooth under human escorts. Colonists begged their leaders to restore ties with humanity, remembering how human convoys had delivered medicine and supplies without fail. Soldiers who had fought side by side with human comrades wrote public letters, recalling the courage and loyalty of their allies. Regret was no longer confined to whispers in private halls. It was shouted in markets and spoken in the streets. The council could not silence it, no matter how hard they tried. Human silence, however, was not emptiness. It was a wall, a shield, a refusal that spoke louder than speeches. The only time humans spoke was through a single transmission, cold and brief, sent after yet another envoy begged them to return to the table. "We offered peace," the message said. "You mocked it. We offered trust. You spat on it. We will not come crawling back. We prepare for ourselves now. Do not mistake our silence for weakness." The message ended there, leaving the galaxy trembling at its blunt finality. The council chamber erupted after the message. Some shouted that humans were declaring war. Others insisted they were only protecting themselves. But beneath the arguments, all could feel the same truth. Humanity had changed. They were no longer the patient mediators who carried the galaxy's burdens quietly. They were building something new in silence, and no one knew what shape it would take. The reptilian warlord, once the loudest voice against humanity, grew uncharacteristically quiet after the message. Even he could see that if the humans turned their strength outward, no species alone could stop them. The crystalline envoys, once mocking, began to plead in private sessions for reconciliation. The insectoid envoy whispered to her peers that perhaps it was too late already. Each night, rumors spread like fire through the stars. Fleets being finished, weapons tested, colonies united under one vision. Humanity was no longer waiting for respect. They were claiming their future without permission, and still the silence held. Council sessions became rituals of futility, words echoing in chambers that no longer mattered. The galaxy's great leaders were beginning to see what their citizens had already realized. Peace had not been maintained by the council's wisdom or the chancellor's grand speeches. It had been maintained by humanity's quiet sacrifices, their tireless watch at the borders, their willingness to hold the line when others faltered. Without them, the cracks widened every day. The silence of humanity was not retreat. It was preparation, and as weeks stretched into months, the galaxy began to understand the most terrifying truth of all. The humans had no need for the council anymore. The council needed them, and for the first time in its history, it stood powerless before the will of a species it had spent centuries underestimating. The first cracks, the galaxy had always seemed fragile, but now without humanity, it began to shatter in ways no one had predicted. For generations, the humans had been a quiet glue that held the stars together, standing guard on the edges, carrying supplies to the weak, and stepping between rivals when tempers flared. Now that presence was gone, and the cracks spread quickly across the council's carefully balanced order. At first it was small, border disputes between neighbors, arguments over patrol routes, complaints about missing trade convoys. But soon those small matters turned into open conflict. On the frontier, colonies that once trusted in human escorts found themselves prey to raiders and warlords. Pleas for help came flooding into the council chamber, but the delegates only argued over who should take responsibility. The reptilian warlord accused the crystalline envoys of cowardice. The crystalline accused the insectoids of shirking their duties, and the insectoids demanded that the avians intervene. No one agreed, no one acted, and the colonies burned. The cries for humanity grew louder, but the humans remained silent behind their fortified borders, watching as the galaxy unraveled. Merchants suffered the most. Trade routes collapsed under constant attacks, and insurance companies refused to cover voyages that once had been routine. Goods rotted on station docks, medical supplies failed to reach plague worlds, and famine began to spread on planets that had long depended on steady convoys. The Council attempted to organize a joint fleet to cover the worst roads, but the fleet disintegrated within weeks, each species pulling its ships back to protect only its own borders. The great dream of a united galaxy lay in ashes, and all because they had driven away the very species that had carried the burden for so long. Whispers turned to anger in the streets of the core worlds. Citizens shouted at their leaders, demanding to know why the humans had left, demanding to know why the Council had mocked them until they walked away. Soldiers spoke openly of how much easier wars had been when humans stood beside them. Traders cursed the arrogance that had pushed away the most reliable escorts in the galaxy. Ordinary people who had once laughed at human stubbornness now begged for their return. Regret no longer belonged to the delegates in their chambers. It lived in every market and every household across the stars, but humanity did not answer. Reports from spies painted a picture that both frightened and fascinated the Council. Human fleets grew larger by the month, their shipyards blazing with activity. Entire colonies drilled day and night, turning even farmers and miners into soldiers. Science stations turned away outsiders, but the little information that leaked out spoke of weapons never seen before, of engines that could outrun any known drive, of shields that glowed with strange new power. Humanity was not preparing for defense alone. They were preparing for a future where they stood independent of the Council, and perhaps above it. The first open war broke out between the reptilians and the crystalline. Their ancient hatred reignited over a border system rich in resources. Without human mediators, the conflict flared into full battles, fleets clashing, planets bombarded, civilians fleeing by the millions. The Council sent pleas for ceasefire, but no one listened. In past times, humanity would have arrived with ships between the two forces, forcing peace through sheer determination. Now there was nothing. The galaxy watched as two great powers bled each other, and the Council proved powerless to stop them. For the first time in living memory, entire sectors called for secession from the Council. Worlds on the edge claimed they would be safer if they aligned themselves directly with humanity, though humanity had offered them no promises. Others threatened to form their own coalitions. The grand experiment of unity was falling apart, and the cracks widened every day inside human space. The silence remained. The leaders of Earth said nothing to the outside galaxy. Their ships did not cross into foreign borders. Their diplomats did not speak, but their preparations continued with relentless focus. To the Council, it was the silence of a storm-building strength. To ordinary citizens across the galaxy, it was the silence of hope, the hope that humanity might return. Though no one could be certain whether they would return as saviors or as conquerors, the empty chair in the Council chamber had become more than a symbol now. It was a wound that would not close, a reminder of arrogance, a mark of shame. Every argument, every failed vote, every desperate plea for order circled back to that seat. The Council had laughed when humanity walked away. Now their laughter was gone, replaced by fear and the first whispers of collapse. The cracks were spreading, and everyone knew the truth. Without humanity, the galaxy was beginning to fall apart, and nothing could stop it. The Council's plea. The war between the reptilians and the crystalline raged on until entire fleets lay shattered, and once thriving colonies had turned to ash. The Council tried again and again to send mediators, but none carried the authority that humans once had. Every envoy was dismissed or ignored. The galaxy had entered a season of chaos, and the leaders of the Council could feel the walls closing in around them. Trade had collapsed. Border disputes erupted into constant skirmishes, and piracy rose to levels not seen in centuries. For every problem, the same truth whispered through the chamber. This would not have happened if the humans had remained. At last the Chancellor stood before the chamber and spoke words that had never been heard in its history. With his golden feathers dulled and his voice heavy, he admitted that the council had been wrong. He confessed that humanity had been insulted, dismissed, and treated as tools instead of equals. The admission shocked the chamber, but it was also a release of tension that had built too long. Delegates who once laughed now bowed their heads, unable to deny the ruin around them. For the first time, the council agreed that they must swallow their pride and plead for humanity to return. A summit was called, one not to mock or dismiss humanity, but to beg for their presence. The council sent invitations written in humble words, not demands but requests. Messages were transmitted across the stars, carried by the fastest ships, each one carrying the same desperate plea: return. The council chamber was prepared with banners of peace, the empty chair polished and set at the center, waiting for the humans who might never come. Delegates rehearsed apologies, words they had never spoken to any species, each one hoping that perhaps humanity would listen. For weeks the chamber waited, hope dwindling with each silent day. Then at last a signal came. A human fleet appeared on the edge of council space, vast and disciplined, their ships gleaming with the light of new technology. They did not arrive as guests, but as a wall of power, surrounding the system with quiet precision. From that fleet came a single vessel, carrying human envoys, and when it landed at the council station, the galaxy held its breath. Elias Ward himself walked into the chamber once more. Months had passed since he had left, yet he looked harder, colder, as though the weight of silence had carved his spirit into steel. The entire chamber rose at his entrance, not in mockery but in fear and respect. Where once they had laughed, now no one dared. The empty chair was offered to him, but he did not sit. Instead, he stood at the center of the chamber, his gaze sweeping across every delegate, and the silence that followed was heavier than any speech. The Chancellor bowed his head and begged forgiveness. He spoke of regret, of mistakes, of the suffering the galaxy now faced because of their arrogance. Other delegates followed, their voices trembling as they admitted their wrongs. Some even wept openly, pleading for humanity to return to bring balance once more. It was a sight no one had imagined. The proud rulers of 100 species begging before the people they had scorned. Elias listened without speaking, his face unyielding. When the last voice faded, he finally spoke. His words were not kind nor cruel, but firm. He reminded them of every insult, every slight, every sacrifice humanity had made that was repaid with scorn. He told them that the galaxy had mistaken patience for weakness, and now they faced the truth of what humanity had always been. He did not promise forgiveness, nor did he accept their apologies. Instead, he declared that if humanity was to even consider cooperation again, it would not be as servants or mediators. It would be on humanity's terms, conditions that would be written by their hand and enforced by their fleets. The chamber shook with murmurs of fear and uncertainty, but no one dared oppose him. The reptilian warlord who once hissed insults remained silent, his eyes downcast. The crystalline envoys who had laughed now trembled in their seats. Even the Chancellor, once so proud, nodded in submission. For the first time in history, the Council did not hold the power. Humanity did as Elias finished speaking. The human envoys withdrew, leaving their conditions written in stark, uncompromising terms. The Council was left in silence, staring at the chair that was no longer empty, but now more terrifying than ever. They had begged for humanity to return, and humanity had answered not as humble participants but as power brokers. The galaxy could not ignore. The final choice. The council chamber was never the same after the humans returned. The conditions they had laid upon the table were heavy, each one a demand that stripped away the arrogance of old powers. Equal votes for humanity in all matters of security and trade. An end to the mocking vetoes that had long silenced their voices. Shared responsibility for frontier defense with resources contributed fairly by all species. And above all, respect for human sovereignty without interference. These were not requests but ultimatums written in the cold ink of necessity. The delegates read them in silence, their hearts filled with the knowledge that rejecting them meant ruin. The Chancellor rose slowly from his seat, feathers dulled and wings lowered. He spoke in a voice weary with shame, telling the chamber that they had no choice but to agree. Some tried to resist. The reptilian warlord hissed about honor, demanding that they not bow to humanity. The crystalline envoys muttered of traditions older than the human species itself. But their words carried no weight anymore. Outside, orbiting the station, the human fleet waited, silent and immovable, a wall of steel and fire that could not be ignored. And deeper still, the galaxy's people had already chosen their side. Across colonies and trade stations, across mining outposts and merchant hubs, voices cried out for humanity. They wanted the ones who had once kept them safe, the ones who had carried their burdens when no one else would. The people no longer trusted the council. They trusted the humans. Elias Ward stood in the center of the chamber as the debate sputtered and faltered. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten, but every word he spoke carried the weight of truth. Humanity had offered peace once and had been scorned. Now they offered terms, not as servants but as equals. The galaxy could accept and rebuild, or it could reject and collapse. The choice was no longer in humanity's hands. It was in theirs. Hours dragged into days, as the council argued, but the outcome was never in doubt. Piece by piece, the delegates signed their acceptance. The reptilian warlord lowered his head and admitted defeat, his people too exhausted from war to fight again. The crystalline envoys, who had mocked humanity most cruelly, signed with trembling hands, knowing their shattered fleets could not withstand another conflict. Even the proud chancellor placed his seal, a symbol of submission to the very species he had once dismissed. When the final signature was pressed into place, the chamber was filled with silence, a silence deeper than any before. For the first time, humanity had not asked for respect. They had claimed it. News spread across the galaxy in waves. On the frontier, colonists cheered, believing at last their convoys would be safe again. Merchants reopened their ledgers, hopeful that trade would flow with human fleets guarding the stars. Soldiers on distant posts raised toasts in memory of human comrades, relieved that the alliance was reborn under new and stronger terms. For ordinary people, it was not politics that mattered, but survival. And they knew survival now lay in humanity's steady hands. Yet the humans themselves did not celebrate. They returned to their ships with calm faces, their fleet withdrawing in perfect formation. For them, this was not a victory but a necessity. Elias Ward told his delegation that humanity had learned a lesson that would never be forgotten. They had begged once for respect and been mocked. They would never beg again. The galaxy had finally seen what happened when humans withdrew, and they had seen what humanity could become when left alone to prepare. The council had been forced to confront its mistake, and the galaxy had been forced to admit a truth it had long denied on Earth. The news was greeted not with parades but with quiet determination. The shipyards did not slow, the drills did not end, and the scientists continued their work. Humanity knew that respect once gained must be guarded carefully. They would sit at the council table again, but this time with their own voice, their own strength, and the knowledge that the galaxy had bent because it could not break them. They were no longer the overlooked species desperate for recognition. They were a power in their own right, unyielding and undeniable. Back in the chamber, the empty chair was no longer empty. It was filled by humanity, not as a guest, not as a mediator, but as an equal whose presence demanded silence and respect. The council had realized its mistake, but the lesson had come at a cost the galaxy would never forget. Humanity had walked away once, and in doing so had shown the stars what happened when the underestimated finally chose to rise. And though peace was restored, it was a different peace, one born not of arrogance but of fear, respect, and the undeniable truth that humanity had become the center no one could ignore. The galaxy had thought the humans would always be there, silent and patient. They had been wrong. Now they knew the truth. Humanity had not been weak. Humanity had been the strongest of them all. Final last part. The council chamber that once rang with arrogance now stood in humbled silence. The banners of 100 species still hung above, but their colors seemed faded against the weight of history that had just unfolded. Where once laughter had greeted human proposals, now respect filled the air like a tide too strong to resist. Humanity had returned not to plead but to dictate, and the galaxy had bowed because the galaxy had no other choice. The fleets that orbited above shone like stars forged into weapons, reminders that patience could harden into steel when tested too far. Elias Ward sat finally in the chair that had once been empty, his presence steady and immovable. The delegates who dared meet his eyes found no anger there, only a calm certainty that shook them deeper than rage. The humans did not roar for triumph. They did not celebrate their rise. They had come to remind the galaxy that respect was not given freely. It was earned through sacrifice and strength, and once earned, it could never again be taken lightly. The Council had realized too late that every insult had been a seed of their downfall, and every sacrifice humanity had made in silence had been the true foundation of their peace across the stars. Ordinary people felt a shift in their hearts. Merchants spoke with relief that trade would flow again under human escorts. Colonists on the edge of forgotten worlds prayed thanks that supplies would no longer fail them. Soldiers who had once fought beside human comrades told stories with pride. Remembering those who had stood unflinching in the fire, the galaxy saw clearly now what had been hidden by arrogance. Humanity had been the unacknowledged guardian all along, and now that truth burned bright enough that none could deny it. But humanity itself did not rest. The shipyards kept building, the drills kept running, the scientists kept pushing further. They had learned a lesson carved deep into their spirit. Never again would they lower themselves to beg for a seat. Never again would they endure insult in silence. They had shown the galaxy what happened when humans walked away, and the galaxy had trembled. They had shown what humans could become when pushed aside, and the galaxy had bent to their will. The Council would never forget, but neither would humanity. Their patience had ended, their silence had spoken, and their rise had become a truth no one could erase. In time, the chamber returned to its routines, but it was never the same. Every decision carried the weight of human presence. Every argument ended when human eyes looked across the table. The chair was no longer empty, no longer mocked. It was the seat of the species that had proven itself the spine of the galaxy, the ones who had walked away and returned stronger than before. The Council had thought them weak, but weakness had never been the truth. Humanity had always been the strongest of them all, and now the stars themselves whispered that truth across every world. The humans had withdrawn. The Council had realized its mistake, and in the end the galaxy learned that to underestimate humanity was to risk collapse. Where patience once held back, now power stood unshaken. The galaxy would move forward, but it would do so under the watchful eyes of those who had proven they were not to be dismissed. Humanity had changed the order forever. The end.